Okay, today we're going to be reviewing the book, The Vanishing Act of Esme Lennox by Maggie O'Farrell. My name is Hannah Mitchell,
I'm Kelsey Brazil.
and we're both grad students at Murray State University. Kelsey, tell us a little bit about what you do. Introduce yourself.
Yeah, so in addition to being a very busy grad student, with my lovely friend here, Hannah, we share cohort classes together. I am an instructor for Colorado Christian University. I teach for three branches of the university, so kind of a little bit of everything everywhere. Lots of composition courses, literature, intro to lit mostly, as well as a slew of creative writing classes. Hannah, how about you?
And I'm a public school teacher. I teach at a local high school that is an oddball little hybrid online public high school. So the only work that I do in college classes is my own, unlike Kelsey. But it's still, I love my kids. They're crazy, but I love them. So let's talk a little bit about this book, The Vanishing Act of Esme Lennox. Um, Kelsey, what would you say this novel was about if you
Oh,
had to
such a
summarize it?
Yeah, such a loaded question. And maybe I'll preface this for myself that when I ask my students, what was the story about? I never want just plot. I really want that deeper meat, which we'll eventually get to. So I'll start where I tell my students not to start with plot. Um, this is the story of a woman starting first as a young woman, a child actually named Esme Lennox, and we kind of follow her life with some really significant gaps in between. But the story of Esme Lennox and how she both exists fully. That might sound like a kind of weird plot point there, but it's important how she exists fully and yet is completely erased, so to speak, from her family in one way or another. And we kind of follow through that thread of not quite a mystery, but a little bit of questions, quite a few questions surrounding the reasoning behind that. So essentially, it's Esme Lennox. We're following her and we're kind of seeing the world that she occupies and the world that she is kind of removed from. Hannah, what would you add?
I would also add that we're following our secondary protagonist, deuteragonist. I don't know. Iris,
Iris. That's
different
right.
flower.
Yeah.
And I like Iris. Iris is an interesting character. She is a businesswoman. She has her own vintage boutique on a very fashionable street. And she has a lot on her plate over the course of this novel.
I think Iris is very much meant to be kind of a mirror in some ways to Esme, and we learn why as we kind of see their characterization, but also their history. And so I think she's meant to carry her own line that is related but independent, like she's distinct in her character and is a protagonist in that sense, but also is kind of a parallel to Esme. Like you said, she's got a lot on her plate, and more is heaped on as you go through the novel. I think she is very much up to the challenge of those things that are asked of her. Even when she maybe kind of defers some of it or wants to defer it or is kind of uncertain about the things being put towards her, she never really backs down. And I think that certainly makes her a protagonist.
I agree. I think that it's within the scope of a review for us to say that the plot centers around Esme Lennox, who, as a young girl 60 years ago, prior to the actions of the story, was committed to an institution
Mhm.
for her mental disorders as her family perceived them. And Iris later finds out that she is the only relative left in both sound mind and body to be a contact for when this institution closes down to find a place for Esme to go, since she's lived these full 60 years utterly in captivity.
Mhm.
And Iris finds out that at very early in the book, and this is how the whole plot begins to unfold, finds out that this Esme Lennox is her great aunt. It's her grandmother's sister, of whom she had never heard. I find that terrifying. Uh, Families are complicated.
Yeah, definitely. I think maybe that's a good segue into just introducing our third kind of main character. Maybe with this character, we want to debate even more about protagonist status, but certainly a main character, and that is Iris's grandmother, Kitty. who is incidentally Esme's sister. Like you mentioned, Hannah, when Iris is the one called up at the closing of the institution called Stone to take on her aunt, her great aunt Esme, it's because, like you said, she's the only living relative of sound body and mind. So Kitty is around, but she is not fully capable to take on that responsibility. She is currently, or at this point, 60 years later, as we've kind of jumped through time, she is suffering from Alzheimer's. And so that really adds to not only the challenge that Iris has in being the one to deal with this on her own, but in any sort of lifeline and making the connection with this great aunt she doesn't know, she really has no one because Kitty is suffering so severely from her Alzheimer's condition.
Yeah, I loved how in the novel Iris's internal narration references her grandmother's Alzheimer's. She says she's away.
I have intimate experience with Alzheimer's in a grandparent who has now passed. And so reading Kitty's later in life characterization and particularly her POV, the narration style that O'Farrell gives to her, struck a really deep and slightly uncomfortable chord. And so that line Iris says, the full line reads, "There's no one left. My grandmother is away in the world of Alzheimer's," is a really, in some ways, really nice, subtle kind of way of putting it. It's full of kind of euphemism and a lot of weight to it. And I think it's very accurate, at least in my own experience, but it's also so much more than that. And I think O'Farrell's entirely aware of that. So I agree. Yeah, that's the line for me that just really still strikes. Even till the very end of the book and talking about it again sometime later, that's the one that I walk away with myself because been there, been there, done that.
There's there's a lot to talk about in this book about autonomy and agency, about
Mm,
ableism, about the expectations people have of each other, and what happens when people don't perform in the way that is expected of them. This
mm,
book tr treats with that through all three of these women and their different approaches to life, which is a really interesting exploration of those kind of ideas. There's a lot to talk about there.
mm,
Um, that's really what resonated more with me was the aspect of mental health and the aspect of performative sanity
mm,
almost as someone who is I myself have struggled with mental health and I work with students who struggle with mental health. There is um, a very specific kind of student that tends to choose online high school, and a lot of times anxiety or depression or things like that come into play when it comes to those choices.
mm,
But it is fascinating what was bad enough for this family to institutionalize their child 60 years ago versus the understanding that we have now about what mental illness looks like, how it presents, and how people grow and age and respond to trauma. Because a lot of Esme's reactions that are not correctly performing her duties as a sane person in this wealthy family
mhm.
are trauma based. And this book explores a lot of that, which is very interesting to read. Um, So those are our three main characters. That's the bones of our plot. I
Yeah.
really appreciate the structure of how O'Farrell wrote this book and the distinct voices between these three women because there aren't any chapter breaks. There aren't any um, headings or sections or acts that it's clearly broken into. It's not
Mhm.
what you would call stream of consciousness, but
Mm.
each voice is so distinct that it's easy to not get lost in the jumble. Did you find it so?
Yeah, I don't find it to be disjointed by any means. If there's any bit of like a feeling or an impression of fragmentation, I'm aware that it's entirely intentional, and I hope that others pick up on that as well. Just talking about mental health, and once we really shift into Kitty's later life kind of POV, that O'Farrell's really wielding that fragmentation, but not in a way that you get lost with by any means. I think, like you said, not quite stream of consciousness. I think the word I'd put to it is just this fluidity. Um, that is not really linear, and that goes in terms of time as well. We kind of go back and forth, nor would I really call it flashbacks in the most traditional sense, but there's just this kind of fluid movement into this world and these women's worlds and who they are as people and individuals, whether that means we're looking at a scene for Esme when she's 14, 15 years old, or when we kind of come back to the quote present with Iris and she is now being um, released from the institution, where Esme is being released from the institution. But so it's all kind of doing this, but I think in a way that just really mirrors how we come to know a person. Even though we're interacting in real time sense with a person, right? And you meet them day to day or across time, how we really come to know them is kind of shifting along with what they reveal or the experiences we share together. So I think that fluidity is really essential to understanding the women and then embracing O'Farrell's structure.
I like it very much. I really enjoyed reading it, and it didn't ever feel like a chore. It didn't ever feel like I
Mhm.
had to be like, okay, well, who's speaking? Like flip back.
Right.
It almost feels like when you look at the book as a whole, it almost feels like an assemblage piece, like a
Mm,
three-dimensional collage. Each character feels like, because it's not in strictly structured flashbacks or flash forwards, because they do kind of slip sideways into a memory or into just a reference that makes sense to them in their head.
mhm,
It does feel very much like each character is very three-dimensional and is an amalgamation of all of the experiences they've had. Nothing seems
mm.
terribly isolated. And I think fluid is a great way to describe it. I would absolutely agree with that.
Yeah,
So,
well, here's another one you saying amalgamation, just a narrative collage in a lot of
yeah,
ways, kind of character
yeah,
collage.
yeah, I like it a lot. I really did. I really, as much as this book was difficult to read in some of its content, I really did enjoy it. I want to ask you a question.
Yeah,
As a college instructor,
yeah.
would you use this in your classroom?
Yeah, it depends on the classroom. In a general sense, I would absolutely recommend this book, as I hope to convey as we get through this review here. But I would recommend it to my readers of kind of any stage, like whatever level of literature class that I'm teaching. I think it would work really well for an introduction to literature, maybe after a little bit of time, as it kind of does break up some of those more traditional structures and kind of paradigms of plot and things that we're used to. But saying that, I think I would most likely introduce it into my creative writing classes as kind of a model text, to show just that use of structure, like we were talking about, that's so unique, but also the use of characterization, the use of voice, the distinction of voice, like you've mentioned, POV, and to really altogether just kind of challenge that straightforward traditional creative writing approach. I think it would work well. The way my creative writing classes work are kind of along the line, a split line of fiction, nonfiction. So this is obviously a fictional text, but it's historical fiction. There's a lot of historical context that's relevant. So I think I would assign it to both sets of my students there because there's so much that can be pulled from it if you're a nonfiction writer or a fiction writer. So I think that's kind of top of the list of where and how I'd introduce it into my classroom. How about you, Mitchell?
To me, the historical connections as a historical fiction book would be fascinating. I would love to use this book as a jumping off place for my students to then do their own research
Mm,
on the history of mental health treatments. I think it would be very cool for them to get into different approaches to mental health as people in the Western world started realizing that people could be treated rather than just locked away. I think it would make a very interesting companion piece to some research, perhaps about the Retreat, which was a Quaker institution that actually treated people like people, and uh, was fascinating to learn about. And
mm,
just to those any reason, why do we tell stories? Any reason
mm,
to get students practicing those empathy skills.
yeah.
This book I think is a really good one to use when trying to teach the concept of sonder, which is the the word that you would use if you, it's like the idea of a moment of understanding, a
Mm,
flash of insight where it becomes immediately clear to you, blindingly clear, that everyone around you has their own internal life that is as rich and powerful and meaningful as your own. And
mm,
that moment of connection is called Sonder. And it's very difficult to explain because it's one of those things where people hear it and like, well, of course everybody's
yeah.
living their own lives. That's the thing. But Sonder is the moment of, oh no, I feel it as reality
Mm,
rather than just hearing it and being like, yeah, okay, well, in other news, water is wet. Uh, and an exploration of the problems that arise when ableism is rampant, I suppose, when no concessions are made
mm,
for any level of difference, when no dignity is granted to difference at all. Uh, Themes of autonomy and agency, things like that, I think would be excellent avenues of inquiry that this book would could facilitate or spark.
mm. Yeah, you saying that that concept of Sonder, maybe putting it in another way, I think you say it might be difficult to kind of understand or explain. I think we literature students are probably clicking immediately as you're saying that. But kind of like this epiphany of empathy, I think
Yes.
is really what you get throughout the novel. And you made me think about, just back to my students, my classrooms, aside from my creative writing students, just thinking about more general kind of intro to lit classes or students. I would really recommend this book to my students who are in medical fields, which I have lots of students, lots of nurses, lots of counseling, lots of fields and degrees like that. And they're typically field students who aren't readers, right? But this is certainly one that I'd say you don't have to be a quote reader. You don't have to be the literature student to get this, but you're going to have empathy, as we all should, right? In any field that we go into. But here's this look at mental health. Read it alongside your textbook or your case study or whatever it is you're doing. So it kind of inspired me. I'm going to jot that down myself, but I think that's an essential way to really bring it in, not just to the classroom in terms of like curriculum, but to our students who are always trying to make better and wiser people.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. It would be cool to have a health field aimed lit,
Yeah,
intro to comp
yeah, it would.
class and really be able to narrow that down, an investigation into empathy and ableism. I think that would be really cool.
O'Farrell gives us a lot of conversation starters,
A
definitely.
lot
Um,
of conversations.
Sexual assault, also not just that act of sexual assault that happens, sexual violence, but also kind of the conception of sexuality. It's maybe one of those more subtle things that we kind of see throughout the novel, but that's certainly a conversation that could be
Absolutely.
had. I wouldn't say that it's like a essential component. You'll get this book only if you have that
Right.
conversation, but it's yet again one of those little bits that O'Farrell's leaving throughout the book that we could pick up and run with.
And I think that in the story, that point that you make is the thing that to me provides so much sympathy for Kitty's character.
Mm,
Whereas I think if that was not, if O'Farrell hadn't included that whole scene, I don't think I would have felt a blink of sympathy for Kitty, even lost and plagued and
mm,
trapped in her own mind as she is with her affliction. Uh, I don't think I would have cared as much if I hadn't known what her life looked like after Esme was institutionalized.
mm.
And the that idea of how did you word it? The development of sexuality or the lack thereof.
Yeah,
Uh,
social conceptions of
the
it. Yeah.
social conceptions of it all. Very, very interesting. Without spoiling it, I don't want to spoil it too much.
So picking up right there, you're kind of mentioning how until that scene, without kind of giving the fullness of that scene with Kitty, maybe less sympathy for Kitty than you might have had otherwise, right? So saying that, are there just any other elements, whether it be narrative or characters, or maybe the structure that we did kind of cover that you wrestled with?
Being a grad student, I was looking for those literary elements, right? the
Mm,
symbolism and the thematic connections and feminist theory lens, engage, Marxist theory lens, engage, that kind of
mm,
thing. And uh, while as an educator, I think that this book is of would be of excellent use to teachers as a jumping off point. I don't want to insinuate thereby that I think it's lacking in literary merit just on its own. I think
mm.
there is so much to dig into, especially with the use of color in this book. And I guess you could say I wrestled cheerfully with those aspects of the novel and found plenty of delicious meat to feed upon in so doing. What about you? Did you struggle with anything specific in this text?
Yeah, so I kind of alluded to it previously, just my personal experience with Alzheimer's. I read that one line, but in the moments, and there's quite a lot of them as the novel really takes off, Kitty in later life and her POV, her narration is really intentionally, like I said, fragmented. There's a lot of use of like hyphens, and so, like you were saying, it's really easy to follow in that fragmentation. That was difficult for me, not in a like a reading comprehension sense or anything like that, but in maybe the realness of what that fractured mind that is suffering from Alzheimer's is like. Um, I had a little bit of a sense. I think O'Farrell has done a wonderful job, hands down. I really do believe that. But I think in my own kind of personal experience, I had a little bit of difficulty just like fully accepting that it's like that in in a way that could maybe too simply find a way to provide a narration structure for that mind. And I think O'Farrell wouldn't at all say this is exactly how the mind works when it's suffering from Alzheimer's. She had to go with something, right? And she does it as faithfully and with full integrity as she can. But that was something that for me, I wanted to say, no, it's not like that, even though my experience and my reality was, yeah, it was. I wasn't in the mind of my grandfather suffering, but I saw the outside of it. And so that was something I really wrestled with there. In terms of just like plot in those moments, aside from obviously the Alzheimer's and just that experience, not so much that I had to kind of work through or wrestle through. There were maybe some characters, especially some of the like more minor characters or side characters that were frustrating for various reasons. Obviously, the Lennox family and the choices that they make and the reasoning they put behind the choices in terms of Esme are beyond frustrating. I think that's a very light word to put it, but even some other characters that I think um, are given a little bit more space in their kind of capacity. I found a little frustrating as well, but I think we're called to be frustrated with those things. We're frustrated with people in real life, so I had
Please
to
tell
kind of
me,
wrestle through that.
please tell me
Good.
that you're talking about the stepbrother subplot.
Yes, I am.
Iris's stepbrother?
Yeah,
Great. Yeah.
yeah.
I don't want to say that he's extraneous to the
Hmm.
novel because he's not. He's there for a reason. That whole
Hmm.
B plot is there for a reason because again, families are complicated
Hmm.
and we
Relationships.
all
Yeah.
relationships are complicated, familial relationships are complicated, and we are all looking for love and approval and companionship, and often
Hmm.
we are looking in places that are not healthy. But yeah, I completely get your whole vibe on
Yeah.
the stepbrother situation.
Yeah.
Um, well, okay, well, what was your favorite part?
Um,
Just entertainment wise,
yeah,
not
which I think
literarily.
is I think that's such a great question. I tell my students that, we're in this literature class and I'm asking them to dissect and make connections and do all those things. But I always try to remind them, like, you can just enjoy it. And I hope you do. And also, if you don't enjoy one of these books or stories, that's okay too. Like, it's always serving both, right? So, what is something that I just loved? I loved the setting. I loved being um, put in Scotland, in Edinburgh, in kind of two different time periods. It's a place I visited a few times myself. And so, some street names came up and just kind of that flavor of Scottish and more largely British kind of culture is always really fun to read. I know that's something that lots of people love reading. So if that's your hook, there's my plug for it. So that's something that was just an absolute delight to read.
I think that in our talk, we've talked a lot about the different characters of this story, and we've talked a lot about the structure of it, the pieces of the story that come together to drive the plot. But we haven't done a significant amount of summary, and I think there's a reason that we're not feeling pulled to summarize this novel. One, because we don't want to give it away for those of y'all who haven't read it yet. And two, the characters very much are the plot.
Mm,
And if we were to get too much more into the weeds on the details, a new reader would lose such a significant amount of the experience
mhm,
of learning about this character because it happens so much of the plot happens in retrospect. It happens in that flashback. It happens in memories.
mm,
And I don't want to go into too much detail on actual summarized structure because you got to get to know the girls first. You got to
mm.
get to know them, and then it will all be made clear.
Yeah, in terms of like creative writer speak here, it's character driven or plot driven, and it's definitely character driven, first and foremost. And like you say, they make up the plot. Not to say there are like conveniences to plot, just to kind of like give us characterization, but our lives are the plots of our own experience, right? And so I think
Absolutely.
that's really what we're getting here.
Yeah, it's definitely a sort of the players cannot keep counsel, they'll tell all kind
Mm,
of
yeah.
moment. And if you say, well, what happens in this story? Well, you're just gonna have to read it. All the little details of the
Mm,
world were a delight. They were a treat. And
mm,
I love that even in a novel that does have, the depths of just depravity or despair, and it also has those human heights to reach as well, which
mm.
is wonderful when a novel can do both. Get you a girl who can do both. That's May Lennox.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Um,
think that's something O'Farrell does is in all of these points that we've talked about with characters and a little bit into the plot of a lot of the tragedy, a lot of the just the frustration, all those things. There's moments of joy as well. We see it um, largely in kind of those past scenes, and that's relevant as well, that they're largely in the past versus in the present or the later future. But I think those moments of joy that we do see, dancing, having beautiful dresses or desiring a specific color of dress and having those moments with people that are, in a loving relationship together, as Kitty and Esme have as their children. I think those are important moments as well. And O'Farrell does them just as well as she does the tragedy.
I think that would be my final take on the book and
Mm,
on, based on our review, here's why you should read it. I think it would be that O'Farrell is an excellent writer of humanity and of the
mm,
human experience. Her novels are always very rich with that experience and the
mm.
texture of life and interaction and
Yeah,
relationships. And sometimes that texture is soft and satiny and lovely, and sometimes that texture can grate. And is that not life?
yeah.
And I really enjoyed Esme Lennox for all the tears I shed over it. What about you?
Yeah, I think my kind of closing comments would be right along the same, sentiment there. For me, Esme is real. I think that's very much what the narrative wants to get across, like quite literally plot wise, right? But Esme is real. Um, her story's raw. And I think O'Farrell invites us into a world that may seem at first glance really different than our own, especially as we kind of move through the past, but it's not. And that's something we have to contend with. And in that, I think O'Farrell gives us a challenge or puts a challenge to us to do something that I think all literature should do, like you've mentioned many times, and that's to feel deeply and truly for human characters, because that's what these characters are, first and foremost. However, they fall into the line of mental health, the stratum of mental health, or social status, or any of those things, they're human first and foremost. And I think that's really what we get from O'Farrell's novel here.
I completely agree. I think that Iris as a main character, I don't know if she would quite count as an audience stand-in character,
Mm,
but we go along with her learning about Esme and Esme's truth and Esme's humanity.
mm,
And I do think that we are kind of meant to hold Iris's hand as she goes through all of that.
mm,
Almost never-ending story style.
mm.
Uh, but it was a good book. I
Yeah,
liked the book. I liked talking about it with you. So
yeah,
thank you for chatting with me and having this little review for Maggie O'Farrell's The Vanishing
yeah.
Act of Esme.
Absolutely. Can't wait to bring it to the classroom and convince a handful of people to read this. So,
Handful of people is always a good start. Thanks so
yeah,
much for joining me, Kelsey. I'll see you later.
yeah. See ya.